Good morning. Thank you guys for coming to join us this morning and for choosing our little panel, because I'll tell you, there's a lot of good competition during this time block. A couple of sessions that I myself wanted to go to, but I had to be here. So thank you for being here with me. My name is Debbie Veney, and I'm a Senior Vice President at the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. And I am also part of a team that commissioned this project with the Harris Poll. So I want to shout out a couple of my colleagues that have worked with me on this, Jennifer Diaz and George Parker and Drew Jacobs here. We really have been working on this for several months, and this is our second year of doing a research project with the Harris Poll. And you're getting our breaking news. So today is when we are releasing the study. I don't know if you guys are Politico subscribers, but we got a nice placement in Politico this morning, and we are continuing to shop the report around. But we're so excited to dig into the data, the research, what it showed us. So this report, Listen to Your Teacher, is it's the result of a survey that we did with the Harris Poll, and it is nationally representative. And I'm joined here on this panel with some fantastic big brain researchers. So they're all of the numbers behind it. You know, they're the steak, I'm the sizzle. So I'm going to let them talk to you about all of the numbers and data behind the report. And we're going to have some time for questions at the back end. But to my immediate right, I've got Drew Jacobs, who is our head of research at the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools, and has absolutely been my partner in crime and keeps me behaving well, because, you know, as a person with the background in communications, I might be prone to a little bit of hyperbole from time to time. And so he makes sure that I get that under control and I'm only saying things that I should be saying. And to Drew's right, we've got Rebecca Purser, who is joining us from the Harris Poll team. So we're thrilled to have her here with us today. And her team actually designed the survey instrument, put it out to field, and did the analysis for us. So we're grateful for that. And down at the end of the table here, we've got our friend Evan Stone, who is a co-founder and also a beautiful research mind at Educators for Excellence. And I thought it was really important to have Evan here today because they have done some polling of their own on teachers. And there's some places where there's a lot of similarity and some places where there's some differences. And so I thought it would be really good to have Evan join us today to give you guys a full look at all of the data that we have on teachers, because it's a pretty hot issue right now, right? Lots of competition to try to hire and recruit and retain teachers and to keep them happy. And none of this work that we all care so much about, none of it happens without teachers. They are literally the lifeblood of everything that we do. So with that said, I'm going to pass off to my friend Drew, who is going to kick us off.
Great. Thanks, Debbie. Can you all hear me okay? Great. So just to set the table a little bit, you know, we've all seen the headlines that are out there in the media, and really just at the National Alliance, we wanted to dig into this topic because it is such a topic that has been kind of on the tops of minds of lots of folks right now. And what we see in the headlines is kind of a mixed bag, right? There's kind of the traditional, or not the traditional, but kind of the common headline that's talking about levels of stress, levels of burnout, the morale that is, the low levels of morale for teachers right now, headlines around staffing shortages, stress, and even headlines that we really don't like to see around, you know, folks who are in the profession of teaching who essentially say something along the lines of, I would not recommend folks going into the profession right now. So it's kind of a mixed bag in terms of headlines. And kind of along those lines, we, as we embarked upon our own study, there's a lot of polls out there right now. There's a lot of research out there. People are really curious about how are teachers doing, how are they feeling, what are they thinking, what's on their mind, how are they feeling as we kind of emerge from the pandemic and move forward in the field of education. And we're going to talk today a lot about the research that we've done with Harris, and Evan's going to talk about the research that E4E has done, but we wanted to talk a little bit also, just, surface a few nuggets from other polls and research. So in May 2023, EdChoice did a poll, and they found that teachers in district schools were much more pessimistic about the teaching profession compared to both private and charter schools. Really interesting. EdChoice also found that more than half of teachers feel a sense of purpose and hopeful feelings when thinking about the future. That maybe runs counter to some of the narratives that you hear out there, right? Like on the previous slide, lots of kind of doom and gloom headlines, but when you actually ask teachers how are they feeling, you kind of surface some different kinds of themes, some different kinds of data points that should really make us curious. Merrimack College and EdWeek partnered recently, and many of you may have seen this. EdWeek has had a lot of coverage around this in May for a poll of teachers, and they found that 42% of teachers say that their mental health and wellness is impacting their work, and 35% indicated that they were very or fairly likely to leave the profession in 2 years. Those are sobering numbers, right? I mean, this is not what we want to be hearing. And then RAND's done some really interesting polls as well and some studies, and they found that teacher turnover increased by a significant amount, 4 percentage points, which doesn't seem like a lot, but this is pretty significant, above pre-pandemic levels, reaching 10% nationally at the end of the 21-22 school year. And then obviously, we've all heard a lot about staffing shortages, and RAND researchers really kind of confirm that through some of their work. 54% of principals saying that they're having a difficult time just like staffing classrooms at a minimum level. So all of that together, the headlines and the research, really motivated us at the National Alliance to try to understand what's going on with charter school teachers. And what I would say at the front is that, and this is just the charter school data and researcher in me coming out, a lot of times charter schools are kind of left out or like blended in with an overall survey sample research. Like a lot of times we don't have the ability to parse what the experience is for charter school folks compared to district folks. And we wanted to field this poll with Harris because we know that our movement's different. We're founded on the basis of being different. We see that in lots of aspects of our work, and so we kind of went into the poll with a hypothesis that we would see different results for our charter school teachers on a lot of fronts, and that's essentially what we found. And so, the survey that we did with Harris, we really covered like a lot of ground, and similarly, Evan, when he talks about the results for E4E, I know that they covered a lot of ground too. We looked in our poll on a whole lot of different topics: teacher retention, teacher satisfaction, thoughts on the culture wars, teacher pay, and a whole host of other topics. So that gives you just a little bit of the kind of background and hypotheses that we had going in. And now I think...
Yeah, so now we're going to hear the research. So, Rebecca, you're up next.
Awesome. Can everyone hear me okay? Seems a little quiet. Is that better? Okay, awesome. My name is Rebecca Purser, and I'm a research manager at the Harris Poll, and I'm excited to walk you all through some of the key findings. I'm sorry? Is that better?
Oh,
there we
yeah.
go. Okay. So before we dive in, I want to talk a little bit about who we spoke to and our methodology. So we surveyed 1,211 U.S. public school pre-K through 12 teachers. Of that sample, 811 were public district teachers and 400 were public charter school teachers. This was all done via a 15-minute online survey. And throughout, the data has been weighted a couple of different ways. So first off, we weighted each group to be representative of charter teachers and also of district teachers distinctly. Anytime that we look at the total teacher population that we surveyed, that was also weighted with a post weight to make sure that it was nationally representative of the spread of charter and district teachers in terms of natural fallout of what that looks like in this country. A few housekeeping notes. Debbie, if you want to jump to the next slide, this can get it started. There's some differences in the way that we have presented the data. There's some color coding by audience because we are going to be talking about the total teacher population that we surveyed as well as district and charter. So any of the blue data and charting is going to speak to the total teacher population. The nice coral color that you'll see on some of the slides is the district teacher population, and then the teal is charter teacher population. I've also included throughout some stat testing indicators. So you won't see it on this slide, but you'll see it on the next one. Anytime that I'm speaking to a difference between responses of charter teachers versus district teachers, that is going to be a statistically significant data point. So basically what we did for the purposes of this study was look at the differences in responses between those groups, and anytime, as I said, that I call out a difference that's going to be a statistically significant one, you can assume that throughout. And then lastly, I'll do my best to keep the wording correct throughout, but again, with that total teacher population, there are times that you'll hear me refer to public school teachers, and that is going to be the total teacher population, and then I will obviously say district or charter teachers if there's differences among that. Okay, so that is all my housekeeping, and now I want to dive into the meat of all of this, and the first is, this major headline that you see on this slide, and that is that 9 in 10 public school teachers feel that public education in this country is in crisis mode. They feel that student mental health is at an all-time low, and that their profession is not only a thankless job, but it is becoming less and less safe by the day. So you will see, if you can jump back to that one, that is going to be the agreement side of the scale on these questions. So the far right statistic is the percentage that agree, and then you can also see how that breaks down by strongly agree and somewhat agree. So when we ask teachers how being a teacher in the US has made them feel over the past year, they overwhelmingly report feeling overwhelmed, burned out, and worried or anxious. So those were some of the main sentiments that came up, particularly for district teachers. On the right-hand side here, you'll see some of the positive sentiments that were offered. So we did a blend of more pessimistic and more optimistic sentiments. And while those were certainly fewer, those that did report some of those optimistic outlooks in the past few years tended to be charter teachers rather than district teachers. Slide. So teachers face a lot of challenges in their line of work. I think that is not a surprise to anyone in this room. What rose to the top when we asked them what their top challenges that they faced in their day-to-day was student discipline and behavior issues, and that was followed rather closely by unsatisfactory pay. We don't have every single data point from the survey in all of these slides, but some other supporting stats there are that teachers are having to spend over a third of their time in their day-to-day on things outside of instruction and teaching. So they're having to, have a heavy-handed approach to classroom management or deal with students' mental health and physical health, things like that. They also reported feeling like they don't have the mental health resources that they need, not only for students, but also for themselves. So across the board, almost 100% of teachers feel that something needs to change in public education in order to recruit and retain teachers. And even if they themselves have not left yet, the vast majority also, recognize and understand why other teachers have left the profession. The next slide is going to show also that around 2 in 5 teachers say that they have either previously or currently considered leaving the profession entirely, particularly in district schools. So that's only around 25% for charter teachers, and that's significantly higher for district school teachers. You can also see that the charter teachers are considerably more likely to say that they have never considered leaving the profession. Okay. So when it comes to the effects of politics on education, we wanted to understand how how are teachers feeling about how politics has infiltrated their day-to-day as an educator? So really what it came down to is that most teachers care about politics, but they don't want it to infringe on their ability to teach effectively. So over 9 in 10 said that they felt like they have been caught in the crossfire of a culture war when really they just want to teach. They want politicians and decision makers to listen to them and to focus more on needed funding rather than additional education mandates. Slide. This next piece was an interesting one that we went into with some hypotheses, and it's around school choice. And we perceive that to be sort of a political hot button issue, but what we found is that it's maybe a bit less polarizing among teacher populations than what we thought. So certainly you can see that there's more support among charter teachers when it comes to public school choice, but even among district teachers, 2/3 or more think that having options for public schooling is important for families, for students, and for teachers. So we've talked about some of the challenges, but we also wanted to understand what would make teachers stay. And I think that this one is probably not going to come as a surprise, but a whopping 85% said that higher pay and better benefits would help teachers feel more motivated, as well as support from school and district administrators and better safety measures. Nearly all teachers say that they want to be involved in problem solving for education, and they want their voices and opinions heard. And I think that this is an important one because it's, I don't know that better pay and benefits will solve some of the issues facing teachers, but this clearly lets us know that that would at least help them out to face some of the challenges that they face in their day-to-day as a teacher. So there's definitely, you can actually go to the next slide. Thanks. So there's definitely some universals that we've covered across the public school teacher experience so far. But where we really saw some distinction in charter and district teacher responses was when it came to their experiences in their school and their classroom environment. So first and foremost, this one is, really kicks it off. Charter teachers are notably more satisfied with their jobs overall, especially in comparison to district teachers. So I believe it's 97% saying that they are satisfied with their role, with their job as a teacher, compared to 83% among district teachers.
Oh, the split between the two teals.
That's strange that you can't see it all.
Yeah.
It's 57% and 40%. Sorry, I did not realize that. You can't see that up there. Mm-hmm. Okay. However, for most teachers, regardless of if they're in charter or district settings, this is probably going to be unsurprising to many educators, but teaching is, it's not just their job, it's a part of who they are and it's part of their identity. So 9 in 10 are agreeing that education is a calling, it's not just a profession, and more than 3/4, still report feeling fulfilled and rewarded through their line of work. But where we see that wane a bit is in terms of, so they're starting out with some of that purpose-driven passion, and that may be waning, particularly for district teachers. So we asked what their motivations were to enter the profession, and then what are their motivations in terms of sort of what gets them up to go to work every day, and whether or not that level of motivation is more motivated now than when they initially entered the profession, or less motivated. And charter teachers are more likely to say that they feel more motivated now than when they initially joined the profession, whereas only around 20% of district teachers shared that same sentiment. So what's driving that difference in experience for charter and district teachers? I think, we certainly don't want it to seem like it's just better teachers. A lot of what it appears to come down to is some of those systems and structures in place in schools and in classrooms that's happening uniquely in charter schools. So charter teachers are more likely to say that they feel valued by their school administration. They feel like their administrators are receptive to their feedback and ideas, and they feel like they're really given some of the tools that they need to meet student needs. They also consistently reported, as you'll see on this slide and the next one, higher level of satisfaction with both the education process and systems at their school, so overall quality of instruction, overall academic rigor, those kinds of things, as well as, on the next slide, aspects of their individual role as a teacher. So this is, their level of autonomy as a teacher, their level of creativity and flexibility and adaptability. So charter teachers across the board had much higher levels of satisfaction with both their role individually, and then also a lot of the systems and processes that were happening at their school as a whole. So those are some of our key takeaways. And I'm sorry, I did not realize that some of those stats, you can't see them on the slides, but hopefully you can still see with the bars and everything what's what. But yeah, that is really the high level overview of what we found. There's lots more to dig into, and I know that I'm sure the plan is to delve into more of that as things come, but those are some of our key takeaways, and I think really speak to some of those universal teacher experiences happening in this country right now, as well as what's unique and what is different, if at all, between the public district and public charter experience.
Thank you, Rebecca. Evan, we'd love to hear about what E4E found, and also if you can just tell us a little bit about your organization.
Sure. Great to see everybody. I'll try to bring a little sizzle on this side too.
All right.
My name's Evan Stone. I'm one of the co-founders at Educators for Excellence. We're a national teacher-led nonprofit. We have about 35,000 educator members across the country, and essentially what we do is we organize teachers to get more involved with the policy-making process. The vast majority of our work is in district schools because we work to change systems that impact most students, but we have lots of charter school members across the country that also engage in our work. And we're about 13 years old. The organization was launched out of my classroom. I was a teacher in the Bronx at PS 86. Yeah, I'm excited to be here with you. So every year for the past 6 years, we've done a national poll of educators, which we call Voices from the Classroom. It's a similar size and methodology. Our poll is drafted by a group of teachers, and then we go and meet with a pollster that helps us turn it into valid and reliable language. This poll from this year, we've honed in on to look at the difference between the overall teacher sample and teachers of color. So our overall sample was just over 1,011 teachers, and then we did an oversample of 300 educators of color. I'm going to talk about the general profession, but I've pulled out all of our crosstab data to talk about the differences between charters and district teachers. But I think the reason why I'm here is because our data is pretty much the same. So, a poll is a snapshot in time on how people feel. Our poll was done in January. This poll was done more recently. And the theme that I want to tell you is that the conditions of teachers across the country is accurately represented in this poll. And the differences between district teachers and charter teachers is accurately represented in this poll, and is sort of, our poll found the exact same information across the vast majority of categories. And so I'm going to talk about a few of those things. The reason we did our poll a little earlier in the year is we wanted to bookend it, we can go to the next slide, off A Nation at Risk. This year we had the 40-year anniversary of A Nation at Risk, which was a seminal report in our country during the Reagan administration, which basically said, if we allow this rising tide of mediocrity to continue, we will undermine our nation and our people. What was different 40 years ago is we didn't disaggregate data. And so what we see when we ask teachers is the conditions in our schools are still not meeting the needs of kids, particularly historically marginalized students. So the table on the left is how teachers think their schools are doing at serving specific populations of students. So only 36% of teachers think their students experiencing homelessness or in foster care are being well served in their schools. Alarmingly, only 22% of teachers think their schools are serving LGBTQ plus students. On the right, I think is the most alarming statistic in our survey, and this is the Net Promoter Score for teaching. So this is asking teachers, would you recommend the profession to others? The vast majority of teachers are saying no. Our poll, we don't think teachers are going to leave in droves. The majority of teachers, 65, 70%, are saying that they're going to stay in teaching for their full career, but they are certainly not telling their kids, their students, their neighbors' kids to become teachers. So this is the national sample. What I will tell you is this is better in charters, but not where we want to be. For charters, we are finding that the Net Promoter Score is only -1. So we're about neutral in terms of the amount of charter teachers who are promoting the workforce versus detracting from the workforce. But in our district schools, when you take out the charter sample, we're -58. So that's the combined -50 there, which is just alarming. It basically means they're like at a point where they are demoralized in their conditions in the classroom, and a demoralized workforce is not only bad for recruitment and retention, but it's really terrible for students because we don't want somebody at the front of the classroom who's miserable and doesn't want to be there. The second thing we looked at is expectations, and we did this because that was the second part of A Nation at Risk, wondering, we have come out of this era of standards-based reform where we focused on raising the bar on standards, assessment, differentiating data, digging in. And what we have found is that there is still broad support from educators for assessments. We can go to the next slide. So overall, teachers believe there should be a summative measure. These numbers are slightly higher for charter teachers. They're basically in line with where teachers of color are across most of these numbers. I'll tell you them in specifics, but what we're finding is that teachers think we should have assessments. Teachers think we should be responsible for the data that our students have. So this narrative that we are hearing, that I think it is the summative assessment that is draining the lifeblood of our schools, is not the experience that most teachers feel. But what teachers are telling us is that they don't get a lot of training on how to use data. They don't really understand when they get data what they're supposed to do with it, or they don't get it in a rapid enough manner. So what we found is that these expectations are right. We also asked, what other measures should we be looking at? And that was really interesting because although teachers believe that we should have summative measures, and I think this is on the next slide. Oh, no, I took that out to be brief. But we asked what other measures should we be looking at? And the highest measure for charter teachers was looking at college going rates. So to this question of what really matters, when we ask our charter teachers, it's going to college. When we ask our overall sample of teachers, it's going to college and access to a high-paying job. So what teachers want, I think, is what families want for their kids, which is setting them up for economic mobility, setting them up for higher education. And so they are pushing for measures that are even more summative than the end of the year and actually asking, are our schools delivering for kids? The next thing we talked about was resources. This was a big part of the Nation at Risk report and drove a lot of the standards-based reform. And overall, we can go to the next slide. What we're finding is we haven't made that much progress. Most teachers don't think that they have high-quality curriculum. They don't think that they have aligned formative assessments, and that they don't think that they have the materials that they need to drive instruction. In our charter schools, these numbers are slightly higher, but only in a couple cases is it statistically significant. So charter teachers are more likely by about 10% to report that they have high quality instructional materials. They're more likely to report by about 7% that they have aligned formative assessments. And they're more likely by 20% to say that they've received high quality training and support. So there is improvement there, but when I think about the gaps on what's going to improve teacher experience, it's making sure that they're set up for success in their classrooms with high quality training, high quality support, and the data that they need to drive instruction. And then the last thing we looked at was really around teaching and time. What's going to retain teachers? What's going to recruit teachers? You can go to the next slide. So the first thing we found is that overwhelmingly teachers think that they have too many responsibilities in their classroom. And this is one area where, I don't know if worse or better is the right word, but we actually found our charter teachers are more likely to say that they have too many responsibilities in their classroom. When I think about a lot of the lean models that our charter networks are running on, or our charter schools are running on, that makes sense to me. But they're still reporting higher levels of satisfaction, but definitely feeling like over time, more and more responsibilities are coming to the classroom as our student population has greater and greater needs, particularly coming out of the pandemic. So that is a real felt experience. On the next slide, we also looked at what would it take to keep teachers in the classroom. And we found overwhelmingly that the most important thing for teachers, and this has been consistent in our national sample for 6 years, is higher pay, is the best thing that would help retain teachers. I agree that it's not going to solve all teachers' problems, but it at least
It makes a firm down payment.
it makes a firm down payment, and we are at a time in this country where we have massive inflation, 7% inflation. Cost of living in our big urban cities is going up astronomically, and teachers are struggling. It is no longer a profession where you can raise a family in most of our communities on a single teacher salary. It needs to be part of a dual income family to make it, and that's just not sustainable. What's really interesting in this is then when you get right below this question, we see big differences after we look at salary. So for our teacher of color sample, what we are seeing is they want pathways into leadership and higher quality support. Those are the number 2 and 3 things that would help retain educators of color. For our charter school teachers, the number 2 and 3 things that are coming right under this are more societal respect for the profession and higher quality supports in their classrooms. So it is about support and training that comes right below pay, but I think it's always important to say that pay matters a bunch in terms of trying to push through this really difficult moment in the profession.
Awesome, thank you. I am now going to lead the group through some questions, and I am going to leave some time for you to do the same. So, Drew, why don't we start with you? We are not exactly completely neutral players in this, right? So we're the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. We care about charter schools, and we came into this project with some hypotheses, some things that we kind of knew from existing data, as you talked a little bit about that. But why don't you talk us through what some of the hypotheses we were when we came into it and what we were hoping that we might see play out in the data?
Thanks, Debbie. I think the biggest kind of headline, which I think you're seeing through the data and hypothesis that we had, was just the overall experience for teachers in charter schools as compared to teachers in district public schools is different, that there's a different experience that's being had. And I think that's an important takeaway that I would share is I feel like the conversation that is had around teachers, and this is not new, right? It's treating them as a monolith, right? Treating them as widgets. And so we went in with that kind of big hypothesis, and I think the data bore it out. Some other hypotheses we had were just around how some of the principles of like the charter sector play into the daily experience of teachers. One of them being, or some of them being like flexibility, autonomy within the classroom, things of that sort. So I think that those were some of the hypotheses that we went into, and then I think also just motivations coming out of the pandemic as well, and just I think we're hoping to find charter teachers feeling maybe a little bit more resilient after the pandemic, given all the flexibilities and kind of ways that charters were able to pivot and serve their communities in ways that were responsive and met the needs of kids and families during the pandemic, kind of emerging from that with a more positive outlook towards the future. And again, I think that's something that we saw in the data.
Yeah, it was really interesting. We were certainly interested in the experience of charter teachers, but not wanting to, as Rebecca said, paint district school teachers as bad in any way, particularly when we looked at things like motivation and how it shifted over time. This is probably my favorite stat of all of it. So motivation for charter school teachers to stay in the classroom, actually 55% of the time went up the longer they were in the classroom. And for district school teachers, it actually went down the longer they were in the classroom by about 66%. Now, this isn't to say that district school teachers are a less motivated lot as a group, but we think that there's something special happening within the charter school environment that helps to keep that motivation fire burning. And I certainly hope that there are some best practices, some scalable practices that can come out of the charter sector and be replicated across the space, because we are all public schools. And if we've got something that's working in one part of it, probably we should look at that, because things are kind of bad with respect to keeping teachers in the classroom. So we should look at all those options. Rebecca, I'm going to ask you, I told you what my favorite stat was, Was there anything in the data that surprised you?
Definitely. I would say one of the biggest surprises to me, so a little background, I worked in education research prior to coming to Harris, but I have never been an educator myself, so take a lot of this with that grain of salt. I think one thing that really surprised me was seeing that student behavior and discipline issues was like across the board the #1 challenge that teachers face. I think just being a sort of a normal consumer of the media, I would have expected safety to be probably the #1 thing that came out on top there. So that was just a bit of a surprise to me, honestly. I have never been a teacher, like I said, so maybe that is,
I've volunteered in my child's classroom, and I'm going to tell you, kids can be bad. You're not supposed to use the word bad to talk about kids, but it can be very challenging. So I've got a lot of respect for educators and how difficult it is to maintain control in classrooms. And, I remember volunteering in my kids' preschool class. Kid was a terrorist, running around smacking all the other kids in the back of the head, but you can't suspend a child from preschool. So anyway, I get how that certainly could be a really important factor in teachers' happiness.
Yeah, and a lot of times when we ask that kind of question, there's a lot more alignment there's a couple right in a row that are right in line with each other, and so for that one to have really risen to the top in the way that it did was a bit of a surprise to me. I also thought that the level of support and agreement towards the concept of public school choice across both audiences was, to be honest, not what I was expecting. Again, just what I've seen from, media coverage probably. I would have expected there to be maybe a bit more orneriness, perhaps from district teachers towards the concept of public school choice. So that was also a surprising one to me.
Awesome. Now, Evan, I'm going to dig in a little bit on this behavior versus compensation thing. Your data came out a little differently. I think compensation was the #1 most important, you'll give me the right words, motivator.
For retaining teachers.
There you go.
What would keep you in the teaching profession?
Yes.
And I think for me, that's what it was. I interrupted your question, but I think anywhere you're going.
Yeah,
to me,
that's
I think we worded this question slightly differently. And I saw pay as sort of the #2 issue for you in terms of what's your biggest challenge. When we asked, so we worded our question, a different question in the poll. We asked, what's your biggest need for support in the classroom? And there, classroom management, classroom behavior challenges was the #1 thing. So I think if it's sort of the day-to-day conditions in the classroom, behavior challenges are massive. If it's the long-term, what would keep you in this? I think compensation is a driving factor in that, and I saw that show up in both these polls. I do think that, I've probably been in 80 different schools this year, and I think the behavior challenges that you can just feel in buildings are worse than I've ever felt them. We just did what we call our Green Apple Excellence Awards, which we give some of our most active teacher leaders an award, and one teacher who's been teaching for 27 years said, this is by far the most difficult year I've had in my classroom.
Wow.
In many places, it was the first year, a first full uninterrupted year. The level of sort of energy that you had to maintain through the pandemic, it's harder to maintain that now. And all of the routines
Do you
have
think
been
the
broken.
pandemic drove some of that? I mean, were behavioral issues worse post-pandemic than before?
So we work in mainly districts that were closed for pretty long periods of time. I will give that as a caveat, and those are most of the schools I've been in. And I would say yes, all of the routines that we spend years and years building have been broken down. So we have some kids showing up to high school that missed middle school, essentially, for the most part.
Or you've got kids that never made it to kindergarten.
Yeah,
They're just chilling at home.
And so,
and then they show up and they're like, I'm not sitting in this desk.
Even if you were sort of in and out, being on screen, the level of apathy that develops, the relational challenges that kids are having now, where they are proximate to other students, they can bump into each other, they can hear each other, all of the things that we sort through. And we build routines, and that sort of repetition and habit building is so essential to behavior management. It was in my classroom. So I think the pandemic is part of this, that is contributing to kids coming back into schools with a lot of that broken down. And teachers in most cases are left in their classroom to figure a lot of that out on their own.
Wow. Rebecca, I'm gonna come back to you for a moment. Let's talk about the culture wars. So We, with the Harris Poll, did a project last year which was focused on parents, and we were very interested in what their reasons were for switching schools. We did not talk about culture wars at all or anything like that. But I'm curious this year, your thoughts on why that was such a strong number, and just kind of digging into a little bit about how parents said that teachers said that they were pretty politically savvy. Like, a lot of them vote and they care about the issues, but they don't like it in the classroom.
Yeah, so I think an important first piece of why that stat is what it is the way that we left sort of what the culture war is up to their interpretation. So I think depending on where you fall politically, that could mean a lot of different things for teachers. So I think that keeping it broad really let them respond to sort of the overarching message and notion behind that without getting into some of the nitty-gritty of what a culture war might mean to them. What I did think was interesting, though, was that we looked at district and charter teachers. We also look at our data through a lot of different lenses in terms of subgroup analysis. One important one that we looked through pretty thoroughly was political affiliation, and to see if especially some of those numbers varied by teachers' political affiliation. And interestingly, they really didn't.
So across the board, whether you're Democrat, Republican, or Independent, you're like, keep these politics out of my classroom.
Yep, that's pretty much what we saw. There was really high agreement with all of these statements, really sort of that wanting it to be a separation between politics and how teachers go about their day-to-day job was definitely a sentiment that was consistent across party lines for sure.
I think that's really interesting because I've certainly heard the criticisms on both sides of the political ideological spectrum. Wherever you sit on this, there's a lot of, we'll say, active opining about what should or shouldn't happen in classrooms, and it's very politicized. And I have a political ideology, so I was wondering if people who might share mine were swinging more one way or the other, but.
Yeah. And we also asked some of those questions in the same vein of, asking if teachers feel like there is solidarity among teachers outside of political affiliation.
Oh, okay. What was
really
that?
strong agreement with that as well, of sort of, if you're a teacher, that's a different lens, and, there's a lot of common ground, even if there's other, whether it's political or religious ideologies that may vary.
So like teacher before politics, like people will say, country over party. Okay. Drew, I've got a question for you, and then I'm going to open up to folks out here if you've got some questions. But if you don't, I've got lots. Drew, what do you think that we in the charter community should take away from these findings?
Great question, Debbie. I've said it a couple times, but the experience that our teachers are having in schools that we're a part of and that we lead as a movement are having a really different experience. And so, this data here and also the data that Evan's team pulled together gives us that snapshot in time, and gives us a sense of how people are feeling and things like that. But what it can't tell us is like the whys. I mean, I have my own theories, and my own opinion of that is just the system of supports, the stuff that's in the ether around teaching, is fundamentally different in charter schools than it is in district public schools. And I mean, I think you kind of have to be like of two minds about this, right? Like, there are definitely sobering statistics kind of across the board in both these polls that really, I think, behoove us to like be serious about like the what happens next part. But I also think for our movement, it's heartening in some ways because there are some spots in the data that are brighter and more encouraging around the experiences that the teachers in our sector are having. And so again, like, the researcher in me is like, well, why is that? That's the curiosity that I would leave, and I think that that's the thing that I would encourage you guys to walk away with too as you go back. It's just to kind of maybe take heart with some of the practices that you're employing, some of the creative things you're doing in the classrooms, the things that you're doing to support people in your networks and in your buildings, while also like taking on that challenge.
So don't throw a parade yet, but it's okay to have a little spring in your step. Okay, I like that. Are there questions from the audience? Okay, yes, I see one right here. We do. We've got the lovely Brittany Baker, who is our mic runner.
Oh, thank you. All right. I'm thinking about the data that suggests that there is a lot of teachers now entering the profession through alternative preparation. And so versus the traditional route where you go through the content, the pedagogy, classroom and behavior management, most of these teachers coming in that's filling the pool are alternatively certified. And I was thinking and wondering, was there any spot in the data to suggest that their responses were based upon where they were in terms of their preparation?
Well, we did ask about how they were certified. And Rebecca, who's super fast, is going to dig into the crosstabs right now, and she's going to let you know if we can see any patterns that are related to that. But we did ask whether they had a traditional certification and an alternative certification, and so we can. But to help her out, can you maybe tell us which specific data points you would want to know about underneath whether there was alternative or traditional certification? Like, are you interested in knowing about motivation, happiness, what? Satisfaction. Okay, yeah, awesome. Okay, Rebecca's on it.
So I can speak a little bit more broadly to that. And one of the biggest things that we did notice when it came to preparation and sort of how they entered the profession was that charter teachers were more likely to say that they had either a teaching certification or an alternative teaching certification when compared to district teachers. So we don't have like a full sort of cut of the data by specifically that lens, but there was much higher numbers of those coming in through that type of preparation for charter teachers. So sort of, I would say more correlational in nature in terms of the charter findings more largely, but yeah, can't speak exactly to what it looks like across the board for those who have, you know, a more traditional route into the profession than others, but there was definitely a larger population of that among charter teachers.
And what I can add to that, and this is, I'm probably going outside of what our research team would tell me to do because the N size are getting pretty small when we cut it down into smaller and smaller subgroups, but half of our subgroup of charter teachers were alternatively certified, and we're finding that our charter school teachers, 80% have strong or favorable perceptions of their teacher preparation program, whereas 60% of district school teachers have strong or favorable perceptions of their teacher preparation program. So I think that like that's overly generous in my standpoint on teacher prep overall, but if you've paid for it, you probably like don't want to say it was terrible. In my opinion, it's like it's a tough question to really get under the hood of because you're sort of through it. But we did not see, I guess my point is we did not see huge differences based on pathway into the profession. We saw slightly higher perceptions of their prep program from charter teachers compared to district teachers.
Thank you for that, Evan.
Good morning. I think I have more of a wondering. So with regards to the research that was the research done to compare charter and district schools, or was the research done to try to create change?
The research was done because we're just curious beavers too. And so teachers are the lifeblood of our work within the charter sector. So we were very curious about what charter school teachers were experiencing. And we thought that the data would be helpful to create change within our system. So we know that a lot of our school leaders are struggling with recruitment, retention, the same as everything else. And we're like, maybe we can get something in here that would be helpful to them. But at the same time, because charter teachers are such a relatively small percentage of the overall teaching space, we thought it would be helpful to contextualize that and to also look at, well, is the experience of a charter school teacher different than what you see in a district school? So not so much to say, beat our chest and say we're better, but really to kind of understand. And if we're going to give school leaders some data about what it looks like to try and retain their teachers within a charter setting, you better talk to charter teachers about that. But we also know that upwards of like about 40% of the teachers that did our survey have worked in both kinds of schools. And so it's like you kind of gotta, as I like to say, I strive for integrity whilst peddling my propaganda. So I like to make sure that we're getting a rich, full lens on this and a good data set.
Debbie, can you jump? And I will just say, for me, one of the things that's coming out of this is about how do we drive change. And when I look at some of the differences, and we go further down, like overall teachers want differentiated compensation. They don't just want more pay, they want differentiated pay, and that's across charters and districts. They want differentiated pay by the subject they teach, the students they teach, and the outcomes that they drive. That is something we have in the charter sector, but we do not have by and large in the district sector. They want more time for collaboration. They want more opportunities for team teaching. They want better support and development. So when I think about the charters are probably doing a little better on these areas, but could we go further? Could we think about how we even drive more release time, how we have differentiated roles for teachers, how we create spaces for team teaching to exist so that we don't have these isolated individuals? And in my mind, that's sort of like we need to move away over the one teacher, 30 students, one classroom model that we know is long broken and hasn't served kids. And teachers are telling us that in this data. And I think charters have used the flexibility that you have to move on that. But I think we could be bolder and bigger in terms of changing the conditions of the classroom to support great teaching and retain teachers.
Yes,
Hey.
we've got a question in the back.
Hi, thank you everyone on the panel for joining us today and sharing. So this question is for Evan. I'm actually a former teacher and a former E4E Minnesota member. So I think we can all agree there's some pretty concerning data here about teacher satisfaction, their mental health and wellness. So I'm wondering if you can share a little bit with us about the things that are working that you're hearing from your teachers. Like what are the supports that are happening in classrooms that are making a meaningful difference in terms of whether they feel supported and want to continue teaching?
So one of the strongest predictors that we saw in terms of condition, well, first, thank you for the question. And that was a picture of our E4E Minnesota chapter up there lobbying at the Capitol using this data. One of the strongest predictors we saw for satisfaction over time was the reporting of high quality support and training in 2 dimensions. So given the culture war fight, we saw that teachers that said that they'd had high quality training on how to implement culturally relevant teaching in their classrooms was a huge corollary to I can't say there's no causation in this, but correlated with their level of feeling, what level of support for teaching overall and for their conditions in the classroom, and also around social emotional learning. Those were 2 huge things. And then the third thing that was probably the biggest driver overall, and had the strongest correlation, was teachers that were reporting that they did not have shortages in their building and weren't taking on extra responsibilities. So one of the big things we saw, and this was when we did this in January, we still had lots of, we had it throughout the full year, but lots of gaps in school buildings. So teachers that are saying that they're covering multiple preps, they're covering lunch duty, they're doing attendance, taking on those additional responsibilities was really highly correlated with feeling burnt out and not successful. So schools that are avoiding those things, that are allowing teachers to focus on their core responsibilities, and that are giving them high quality training around these key challenges that we know, which are the mental health challenges we're seeing in schools, so the social emotional learning, the sort of political fight, being able to get beyond that and have a clear theory in your building of what culturally relevant teaching is, or culturally responsive teaching is, or culturally affirmative teaching, whatever language you want to use, like having teachers understand what they're supposed to be doing and not get caught up in the sort of broader fight, those seem to be working.
Well, that was a better question than mine, but I'm going to ask mine anyway, because it's along the same lines, and I appreciate what you said about differentiation. I'm from Arizona, and in the last 5 years, the teachers in our schools are making 30% more than they were.
Wow.
And my satisfaction surveys are still coming back, not particularly satisfied.
Wow.
So with respect, I adore teachers. Like, what's the point? The data point that I would like to be able to take back to my school board or my legislature is 5 times the federal poverty level, or as much as the average doctor? Or what point will make those teachers feel respected? Is there a number like that out there?
Wow, that's that's a tough one. I'm gonna give it to the researchers. Wow, can I ask a clarifying question though? So this is specifically within your school network, or is this across the state?
2018 to 22, there was a 20 by 22 state law that we had to have 20% increase in pay by 2022 in those 5 years.
Right.
And this past year, my schools, all our schools as part of our public annual budget have to list now since that time, this is what our teachers made last year, this is what our teachers made this year, this is the overall percentage increase. I just put those out there like 11, 12% this year.
Wow. I got another question for you. I know you're supposed to be asking us the question.
I love the microphone.
Okay. I'm curious about the demographics of your teacher force. I'm wondering, younger professionals often like to get a promotion, like, every month. And my daughter is one of them. And I have to tell her child, no, stop that. Don't ask anybody that. I'm wondering if younger teachers have, just different expectations of like what their salary should be. And I think some of that is fair, related to the higher cost of living, the student loan debt. So I'm not picking on millennials, but I'm wondering if it's skewing towards a younger age group.
Our demographic, our schools have been, we were founded in 1995, so
Okay.
I have a broad range of ages, but I hear you on that one. I feel like being of the older generation, my daughter's a teacher, it's not unfair to expect that a person could raise a family, and that's not an expectation of, my generation, so I hear that.
Excellent. Okay, big brain researchers.
Unfortunately, the short answer is that I don't have a stat to speak exactly to that, of course. I do think that there was some variance that we saw in urbanicity specifically. So teachers who live in a rural or small town setting, across the board, in a lot of scenarios, reporting more pessimism. That is obviously very correlational in nature. So I don't have something to speak directly to, what that level is of sort of the tipping point when it comes to their income. But yeah, that's probably the closest in line with what we found in the research from this one.
We didn't ask the question, and I'm trying to remember if we ever did. Maybe 4 years ago we asked like how much of an increase you would be looking for, but I would need to go back and look. So maybe it's a good question for us to ask in the next year. But I think my answer to this is like money matters, but it's not all that matters.
Yeah.
And I think it is necessary but not sufficient for the LSAT takers out there or something like that.
Right.
But I think it is the other things that matter on satisfaction. I think money matters on retention, long-term retention in the aggregate for huge populations of teachers, because I think if we don't make our salaries competitive overall, we will continue to lose talent.
That's right.
But I think at the individual school level, it is the relationship with the administrator, it is the level of support that they have, it is the connections they have with their fellow educators, and that time to collaborate and build community. Those are the things that I think drive satisfaction at the building level.
I think I'm probably 1 minute over time. But, someone said just keep going. All right. I feel empowered. Thank you for giving me the agency to do that. Is there one more question, or are you guys ready to wrap up? You're wrapping up. Okay. Thank you so much for spending your morning with us.